Well, hello. Thanks for coming to my talk. It's always nice to talk to people, although talking to myself is also fun sometimes as well. Well, anyhow, as the title goes over, I want to go over, these are like practices, ways organizations do things, tactics, if you will, when there's as we call it nowadays, a platform in place. The stack of stuff that you deploy your applications on and run them, and sometimes the associated tools, depending on what you think a platform is, which is very much so an interesting not evolving. There's a lot of discussion of it nowadays, as we'll get into. So I like to start, sometimes, often, I'm not talking to developers, which I assume many of you are writing code. So I, often like to start when, I don't know if you've ever met infrastructure people who work on things underneath there, but they often don't have in mind our mayonnaise friend here, sort of the developer people, the point of a stack. Now, I haven't programmed in a long time. I won't tell you how long, but I'm an application person myself, right? And so I always like to start any discussion of something below the application layer, a platform, by reminding people like what the point of all of it is, right? If you build up a stack of infrastructure, whatever it may be, a platform, even a whole bunch of middleware, and then there's no application on top of it, you've really done a whole lot of exciting nothing. Right? Until you actually run an application on top of it, there's really no point to any of it. So to give us kind of like a baseline of that, I'll tell you a story of this guy. That's actually what I look like without a beard. From just yesterday, I grow beards quickly. Anyhow, this is a story from quite some time ago. But I think it represents the ideal state of doing applications, and also, again, the point of everything that's going to come after that. And this is an example of there's a team of developers who were told at a food services company, someone who delivers food and who also will run a kitchen for you, like a big commercial kitchen at a campus or university or whatever it may be, a business. And that organization, they had this team of developers, and they're like, as a business, we obviously want to have good customer service. We want to make food that is good enough that people will enjoy it, if not fantastic, that allows us to continue being paid to do this. And, we want to have good customer service, good food. And also, we also need to optimize. It's very analogous to what we do in software and infrastructure. We also want to optimize the way that we make this food. We want to follow, if you will, a run book or a recipe book, a cookbook, they call it, a literal cookbook, not the way we metaphorically talk about it. And so right now it's done in paper. So of course we need to digitize it and put it on iPads. And that is going to help us meet the goals of the organization that we have. I guess it's also good to remind people the point of applications. If you're not achieving some goal with it, then you're just like making funny pictures, which also has a goal, I suppose. But so the team of developers went in here, and so they're told they're going to digitize this cookbook onto iPads. But because they were following a more product-driven sort of way of doing development, what I would think of as the best way of doing software, if you believe it, they actually would get up at like 4 a.m. and go into the kitchen, and they would stay there for several days and observe the people, what they were doing. Not even using software, but just seeing what their users, if you will, what their lives are like. And what they observed, right, another great thing, best practice that you do when you don't have to like worry about YAML and things like that. You can watch your users actually doing their lives. They observed that these people, this guy, me, if you remember, not really, of course, just in case you didn't get that. They were running around the kitchen, and they were going around, and they were getting a thermometer out, and they were measuring the temperature of mayonnaise and raw chicken and other things. Because, of course, when you're running a commercial kitchen, also a chicken, you have to make sure that you don't induce food poisoning, which is the ultimate bad customer experience, if you've ever experienced that customer experience. Not good. And also there's governance. Again, there's a lot of great analogies to what we do in computers. There's also a governance process, an auditor known as a health inspector who comes in and makes sure that you've been keeping track of these temperatures at the correct allocated time. And that, of course, was a piece of paper as well. So the team of developers observes that the people in the kitchen are spending a lot of time with this toil, and they think, well, that's great that our bosses told us we should put the cookbook on an iPad, but maybe it would be even more effective to reach the goals that our organization has if we automated and if you will, digitized, measuring the mayonnaise. And so sure enough, if it wasn't successful, I probably wouldn't be telling you this story. I'd pick another one. But sure enough, what they found is as they worked on this week after week, being able to kind of experiment and get a new feature, a new way of doing it into production, if you will, what they found is that it not only reduced a lot of that toil that the kitchen had, so they could free up their time, again, just like in our wonderful world of computers, they freed up their toil time to focus on these lovely dishes here, and actually doing other things that more met the goal of good customer experience and kind of optimizing how they're running. And eventually, they went on to digitize the cookbook and things like that. But the point there, one, is I think there might be a better way of thinking about and doing software, but this idea of having the ability to go in and observe how people are working, think about and experiment with on a weekly basis. I guess you could do it daily, especially if you're more online companies, but weekly's fine. Go in and experiment by actually just adding features and doing stuff with your code to see if you're actually achieving the goals that you have. And what comes into play here, like I was kind of joking about earlier, is that's a lot of time that you need in addition to writing your code to just observe what people are doing and kind of get familiar with how people are using your software. And that is where platforms come into play in several different ways. So the first issue that comes up is if you, this is kind of like a core way of looking at it, right? So if you remember, I was saying one of the things you need to do is observe how people, well, I guess this is all I was saying, aside from the mayonnaise part. You need to go in and observe how people are using their software, find out kind of what their problems are, what toil they have, or how they could do things better. And then on a weekly basis, come up with experiments, deploy those experiments, and see if it works, right? Back when I was a programmer, we forgot that last part to observe if it was actually useful or not. We would just give our software off to someone and then go home, which was awesome, and then come back the next day and not really care. But nowadays, it's a good idea to observe if your experiments, your software actually works. Now, the problem is if you track, as I do, because it's part of my job, not because it's super entertaining, but if you track what the kind of averages for deployment frequency are, they're actually not that great across the industry, right? I'm sure everyone in this room, you have a very optimized way of running and things are cool, but when you're talking with your friends who aren't here, maybe you can be a little more sympathetic and empathetic about the plight they're suffering from. But as you see, studies vary, right? If you go to the CD Foundation recently released a study, and they have a much more optimistic numbers, but if you look at things like Forrester and other analysts, and there used to be, I forget, they call themselves digital AI now, but they used to be called something else. They used to do a annual State of Agile report for 13 years. But this is basically what you end up seeing is that more or less 50 to 70% of organizations, it actually takes them more than a month, if not a quarter, if not a year, to release their software. So think about that, right? If you are in the mayonnaise situation and you're I don't know, we'll see in 4 weeks if this solved anything. It would not really help you figure out things very rapidly about how to evolve your software. So this is there's many things to focus on, but getting this down is a good kind of simple thing to focus on of why a platform becomes important. There's, of course, all sorts of other things your stuff should run and work and be available, which is cool. Also something we didn't always focus on when I was a programmer. But this is a nice thing to hang the whole deal on. So before we get into that, this is me. I went back, I live in Amsterdam now, but I went back to Texas, back to Austin, and I found this in my shed. As you see, this is FY05, which probably means it was 2004. And this is that's around the last year that I programmed. I used to work at this place, BMC Software. And you can see, this is our Team Innovation Award. So I was doing big things and getting odd rewards instead of monetary compensation, which I would have much preferred then and now. If this was more a stack of cash, that would be cool. But this is pretty nifty, I guess. Anyways, I work at VMware now, and over my career, if you will, I've been an industry analyst at I was at Red Monk and then 451 Research, and I've done mergers and acquisitions when I was at Dell. But I started working at Pivotal, if you know them. the Cloud Foundry people and other things, about 8 years ago, and now I'm at VMware because we were acquired there. And I work in the part of VMware called Tanzu that builds out platforms like this, and where the all the Spring Framework stuff is done, and so forth and so on. But that's me. I mean, if you're really interested, I do a bunch of podcasts and write things, and you can find it all there if you're into that kind of thing. So first, let's get into what a platform is. As I was saying at the beginning, there's a lot of discussion about platforms nowadays. You know, we kind of go in and out of that. So it's good to kind of figure out, to check in, to see what situation platforms are and what they think people think about them. So kind of contrary to what I was just saying, this is from 2018, but I think it's still a good definition. Of course, every time someone at ThoughtWorks writes something over the last 8 years, I'm like, ooh, why didn't we write that first? That would have been great. But they've got this great speed about writing up ideas in the industry, which is fantastic, which is kind of the type of marketing you want for a consulting firm, to be like, hey, we're smart. So good for them. But this is a great definition. I realize you can't click on that now, but if you get the slides, you could go read the full article. But you can see there's two things that I think are important that you'll see evolve here. One is the set of actual stuff, the tools, the runtime environment. But the second part of that is the whatever you want to call it, the process, the methodology. If you want to be all fancy DevOps report, you could call it the culture, which sounds cool. But you can see it's kind of the way that you think about not only running this platform, but also evolving the platform, as we'll get into. There's this key word here, product, right? Like you start to think in a product-oriented way about the platform. So, you know, I think it does become pretty interesting and kind of obvious what a platform is. And we'll get to like what it is currently, but we have this great habit, depending on how old you are, this might go back even further from you, but you need a platform to run your application on, right? Like unless you're doing like, I don't know, some weird little command line thing, and that's all you really do. I guess arguably a desktop application maybe doesn't need a platform, but once you start having larger and larger applications that multiple people use, you end up having this stack, a platform of things. And we have this great practice in our industry of just like reinventing it every, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, depending on what's going on, which is fine. I used to have a lot of consternation about this because, you know, I don't know if you've ever met more experienced older programmers, but they get very upset when you don't just fix things that exist. They're always like, oh, you know, we already have this, why don't you just use that? But I think the reason is because every time we kind of like flip the table on all of these things, we incrementally add new things to it, right? We add maybe a new infrastructure layer underneath. We add a new way of thrilling things like packaging and deploying. We add new types of middleware. So all along this route, like, you know, you can go through each of those things and all the things not listed there, like things change and evolve a little bit for the better. And most recently, you know, we were previously in this era of platform as a service, or PaaS, which some people still have a bad reaction to that. But like things were cool. And then our friend Kubernetes came around here and we were like, oh, how about we just get rid of all of that and we rewrite the platform on top of it because we have Kubernetes here. So that's really where we are at the moment, is oddly enough, there's not a tremendous amount of people who run applications in Kubernetes, but the focus of the platform area is rebuilding that stack on top of this new infrastructure there. Instead of necessarily, as we don't do like moving these platforms over. And what you see in this era of platform stuff is we're at the beginning of building out these platforms, right? And this is from our very recent State of Kubernetes survey. And, you know, it's important to recognize that we're at the beginning of building out a platform. And that's why I like to give this talk to say like, hey, let's not make the same mistakes, or at least let's make those mistakes better this time than the last few cycles when we rebuilt a platform. But you can see what we're suffering from now, and this is 4 years ago and now, basically, is that when it comes to application developers, and again, our goal of shortening release cycles, we're kind of like decreasing in the effectiveness of that as more and more Kubernetes usage is out there. And you can guess that's because we need to finish building out a platform on top of it. And, you know, just as an aside, I think this is potentially, I mean, who knows with surveys, right? They're just surveys, and they could be wrong, they could be right, they could be whatever. But they're fun talking points. By the way, this is a fun little outline you can do in PowerPoint that makes it look like you drew it on there, which is great if you're ever into making slides. Anyways, like I think there was a bunch of early adopters and users of Kubernetes who, are always very enthusiastic and put up with whatever and will stay up and do things the hard way. They had plenty of success, but as you get more and more Kubernetes usage, as it kind of spreads out to the rest of us who just want to get on with our lives, again, not me, I just make slides, but people who aren't those like early adopters, you can see it's causing the shortened software developer cycles to lengthen, which I think is kind of not cool. And I think the reason that is, again, because we're at the beginning of building out platforms, and once you get Kubernetes stood up, this is what you achieve, right? Like pretty much what you have is a blinking cursor. Like you don't have an application, you don't really even have like a stack of middleware or runtime environment. You have like an implied distributed app architecture. You've got all sorts of tools at your disposal, but as a developer, you're sort of like, all right, here you go, have fun, right? So this brings in a lot of mayonnaise related activities that of course you need to focus on, which is totally fine, right? Like that's the intention of this layer, is now it's ready to have a platform built on top of it before you have to figure out what to do beyond this blinking cursor here. Now, what you're going to end up building, just to give you two examples of it, right? This paper came out from the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the home of Kubernetes and many other great cloud native products, which is to say projects. But this paper just came out. They finalized this. I used to use a version they had from October. But what you're going to end up when you build a platform, you can kind of predict what it is, but it's all going to look kind of the same, right? And again, what it ends up being, if you think of your application on top of it, is all of that stuff between your application and the infrastructure at the bottom, right? Which is to say, nowadays, whether it's like something like Kubernetes or more cloud primitives or whatever you may be thinking of, right? But you're going to need a place to store your data. You're going to need a way of doing your coordinating and messaging between things. You can think of that as a service mesh or whatever, but just like calling over the network between the various components you have, packaging up your applications, setting configuration, all of the things that you need to like run a moderately scaled to large scale application. Now, what's interesting about this evolution of platforms is that there's a lot of developer tools in here. Like this is kind of an area of it. And if you look at things like whoever came up with this phrase, just marketing genius or phrase genius, a internal developer portal, which, if you came up in the Java enterprise world, as I did, you see the word portal or portlet, and you're like, I don't want anything to do with that. So like portal is a bizarre word to choose, but I think maybe the people who came up with that don't come from the JEE world, so they have a good reaction to portal. They're more thinking about like traveling to other dimensions and things like that. Anyways, if you look at things like internal developer portals, most popularly implemented by like Backstage and things like that, this notion that what was once application lifecycle management, what does SDLC mean? Software delivery lifecycle, like those tools that developers are focused on, like, all that Atlassian stuff, basically, and kind of GitLab stuff and all that, like that becomes part of your platform as well, which is different than kind of the previous era of platforming, right? The notion that you're going to fully integrate and rely on that chain of tools to be part of the platform to make sure that the platform is useful is, I don't know, I think an evolution of the idea, and maybe worth all the table flipping to get through that. So again, there's a reference architecture over there. Here's the one that we work on, and you can see basically you're going to end up with the same thing. Just us vendors are going to have like cooler backlit stuff and our own fonts when we use it instead of the Easter egg kind of like patterning over there in pastels, which is fine. Now, as I mentioned, just to like kind of get into it, right? Like this is it's about a year old or so, but this is an idea of what that internal developer portal is, right? And then I'll get to the best practices after this, after we've defined a platform. But I think if you combine together all of these things, which, as you look at them, there's a lot of like normal platformy stuff, but as you get over here to the, I guess it would be your left side, you can see these are things that are more like stuff that the development, the software, the app teams care about than like your infrastructure sort of team. And the benefit of integrating those things more tightly into the platform is, well, I just use that word, integrated. That things work together, that you don't have to kind of like custom fit the way that you're building things or custom fit the way that you're handling your registries and all of that stuff and your API management. like it just works in the platform. And then also, if you're the kind of developer who prefers to move pixels on the screen rather than like mess around with low-level stuff, which sadly there's probably not enough developers in the application space who have that mindset. But it also means someone else is responsible for all of that stuff, and you don't have to like worry about it, which is not really cool in the first year of work. But I don't know about you, but when I develop stuff, like I would love to build out platforms and infrastructure stuff. And then the second year, I was totally bored by it and didn't want to mess with it. So it's cool to have someone else who's paid to be bored with that stuff year over year instead of you. But if you're not familiar with this idea of an internal developer portal, again, I realize you can't click on this. This is a pretty good paper that you can read for free if you want to, but it'll give you a notion of how things are different. And I think what the genuine, other than having Kubernetes running underneath it or whatever, this is the genuinely new thing when we talk about platforms nowadays. So let's go over best practices for platforms, right? So we got this idea. First, we want to make sure that we're automating measuring mayonnaise so that beardless me can cook better food and run the business much more better. The problem is our release cycles aren't very good, so we can't have this kind of product-driven, exploratory, very design way of thinking about doing software so we can discover better ways to optimize the kitchen, right? Because deployment frequencies are pretty bad year over year over year. I mean, think about it. Like, how long has it been since we've been thinking about, like, you should deploy at least once a month? Or even from the XP days of, like, I don't know, 97 to 99, where you want to deploy every week, and here we are, not doing that. So you need to have a platform in place that takes care of all the stuff below the application. And so once you have this platform up and running, then what? Like, what are the practices that you do to run it? Like, how do you make sure that you achieve all the goals and the hopes and the dreams that you had? So what I'm going to go over here is, thankfully, because we have this kind of eternal reoccurrence of platforms, my hope is that like we can look at how previous platforms were run and the practices that those teams have had. Mostly the people I talk with are mostly at large organizations. Like, what did they do that worked when they were running a platform? Because again, other than adding on new things, the platform ends up kind of being the same, and you sort of end up doing the same stuff, just with different names that either are funny or like very boring, depending on which era that you're in. So a lot of these practices are pulled, again, from that previous era, from the, let's call it the PaaS era of platforms, from people who use Cloud Foundry and other things like that. Some of them are more recent, but they occur over and over again. So the first thing, which is kind of implied by this, is that you actually have a platform team, right? Like a team of people who are in charge of running the platform. Now, starting maybe about a year ago, I haven't really tracked this down, but there's a passel of internal developer portal vendors who were like, I know what we should do. Instead of using the phrase DevOps, we should say platform engineering. And so platform engineering has kind of supplanted all of the previous phases to mean that team, that role that runs a platform and builds it out, all the stuff that's below developers. So that's the first thing, which I'm thinking I should probably put that in. I'll have a bonus practice of the implied one of building a team. But having that team instead of a bunch of application developers running it, let alone having a bunch of platforms out there, tends to be what I see year after year in large organizations who have platforms. So when you're building this team out, so you're starting this platform team, right? This is kind of the first thing that I see these teams doing who end up being successful. I guess I could tell you things I see them do that ends up being not successful. That would be fun, but this is about best practices, not tragic ones. But if you think about, so you're building a platform, you're a platform team, and to use kind of a word that's, some phrasing that also like, back when I was a developer and developers kind of don't like, you're going to try to centralize and standardize a platform. But hold on, there's a way that you're going to get over the annoyance of that. But the first thing that you think about is like, all right, so let's go all the way back up the stack to the mayonnaise. And what we're doing there is, again, we're trying to help the user out, which means we're trying to help the developer out. And ultimately, what we as the platform team are doing is we need to make sure that the process of getting software from idea to running in production is as optimized as possible, as quick as possible, and works as well as possible. And so what we need to do as a platform team is we need to get an idea of the end-to-end process, everything that happens. People will call this a value stream or a pipeline, or kind of confused marketers will call it a secure software supply chain. But whatever this may be, what these platform teams do is they whether it's I don't know, online with some Miro boards or physically in a room somewhere, they'll spend about a day or so and they'll get some developers in there, maybe some enterprise architects, maybe security people if they're not too grumpy, and then the platform people, and they'll say like, all right, so we need to figure out every activity that happens, so let's draw that on the board. And then we need to have just some rough estimates of how long it takes to go through each box. Now, I should know the difference between lead time and cycle time because like I'm from that world, but like I got 3 kids and I need extra capacity to deal with that. So, put in whatever you want for lead or cycle, but basically the time it takes to travel through each box, right? Now, that's the first step in doing this, right? Because that, you add that up and you're like, oh, it takes this long to just get some code into production. But what I've also found in observing these teams is actually the most important thing are these arrows, right? Which you can say the word handoff, but these arrows are often overlooked. So it's really good to think about what happens in these arrows here, right? Like, for example, and it can be variable throughout the year, but back in the States, there's this period of time between the last week of November and maybe January 5th or 8th, if you're lucky, where we all pretend like something's going to happen, but it never does. Because what we have in that last week, we have this, I was shocked to find that in the rest of the world they don't celebrate Thanksgiving like we do, especially in the Netherlands. It's really hard to find a turkey that's sizable enough. But you have basically this week off at the end of November, and then you got like 2 weeks where you're just like, I got to go buy some gifts, for the holidays coming up, and then everyone's out for like 2 weeks. That's a terrible time to plan to release software. But that's like one of these things that sometimes shows up here, right? Or needing to just wait to schedule a meeting with someone to do the handoff. So anyways, this becomes, I think, in an interesting way, the product of the platform team, right? They try to be in charge of automating and taking care of this as much as possible. Now, of course, they can't do everything, but it also kind of it shows you why the development tool chain is something that the platform team is interested in, right? Because a lot of those tools that you see are running this whole process here. Now, a fun thing to do when you're doing that is like not only, never mind how long it takes to ship actual software. What if we just wanted to change the font that we use? So we just want to change one line of code. And then what would it take us to deploy that brand new, right? And let's draw that diagram up there. And you can't cheat by saying well, we don't need to have all the meetings for the change review board and the security check. You got to go through every single thing, even though it's one line of code, and see how long that takes. And even more darkly comical thing is to say what if we didn't actually even change a line of code and we just ran the process through there? And how long would that actually take to deploy exactly the same thing, but having to go through the entire process through it? So that's a good starting point. And indeed, that's what a lot of these platform teams do when they assemble people in the room there. So you start going through and kind of building out what the components of all of those little boxes are and the handoffs are, right? And this is where the platform teams start to think about what components are available, how would we assemble them together, what are the practices that we have, what exactly is a golden path or not, depending on what month it is. And you kind of think about, all right, here's the way that we're going to build out the platform that we have that really runs that product of the value stream, the pipeline, whatever you might want to call it. And this is a little bit, this kind of broken out more temporally than those big burgers of stacks over there of how things integrate together. But it starts to get the platform team to kind of figure out what they can help out with. Now, so there you go. You've figured out the kind of flow that as a platform team you focus on, right? And again, the people at large organizations I talk with, they spend a lot of time figuring out and optimizing that kind of pipeline, that flow of things. And it's one of the metrics that they often use is the travel time to that whole flow. Again, lead cycle, I forget, but whatever that is to actually get a line of code out the door, and that becomes something that they pay a tremendous amount of attention to. Now, the second mind shift that they have, and if you've ever worked in or with infrastructure people or operations people, whatever you call them, they don't necessarily think about developers as people that they should work with, let alone as customers, right? And this idea of thinking about, if I'm an infrastructure person, a platform person, I'm building this platform for developers, so maybe developers are like my customers, right? And probably what I should do, and is thankfully there's a practice that's been around for maybe 2 decades or so, depending on how you count it, called product management, which application people are usually very familiar with. And of course, us at vendors and other places, that's our deal. So we know how to do that. But taking on this idea of product management is something that's often new to infrastructure platform-oriented people, right? And this is summarized by Thomas over here at Mercedes-Benz, who runs a platform team there. And they really do think about, like, we're building this platform for developers and we're product managing it. Now, what does that look like? I mean, here's a little bit of, like, this is kind of just a generic, like, kind of mayonnaise approach to things, right? The product way of thinking about doing software that also applies to thinking about building platforms, right? And, to really, really simplify it, like, well, first of all, in this team, you're going to need a product manager, which is just like sometimes to like add to the infrastructure world, right? And a product manager, of course, like looks at what their customers are doing, the problems that they have. They also get input about like the constraints they have, the hopes and dreams they have as an organization or a business. And then they also talk with the more technical people. And eventually, and again, I know I'm very much so simplifying it, they're like, here's what we're going to do this week. Right? So they're the ones who are picking, or at least initially driving, which features are in there, which way to, as we jokingly say, prioritizing the backlog. Now, of course, a product manager does a lot more than that. And what I've observed is as the platform teams mature and they sort of gel together more, that notion of managing the product tends to spread out to the team as a whole, as the whole team kind of has ownership and knowledge of what's going on. But you have this one person whose job is to understand that product customer fit going there, which is often a brand new role. Well, sadly, sometimes for application developers, but is also pretty much always a new role when you're building out a platform team. So doing that product management becomes a vital part of how you do platform stuff. And you might be hearing, you might have heard in the platform engineering cloud of exciting discussion, there's this tug and pull between an older phrase, platform as a product, and platform engineering. And like, I think in the past month or so, like us product people are trying to like insert product back into there, which is great because, that way you build stuff your customers, your developers want. Now, how does a product manager figure out what to do initially, right? Because a lot of the difficulty in getting a platform in place is like the first 6 months, the first 12 months, figuring out what to do, right? Now, you can't just go and observe a room full of developers doing their work like you can the mayonnaise people, because it's just going to be like this, right? Like there's nothing to observe, really. So you can't really discover what they're doing. So often platform teams will do something like this. And I worked with the people, some people in our organization who've done this to. It's not like open source, but it's just freely available to use. You don't even have to pay us anything. You can just outright take it and do things with it. But what this is a developer toil audit. And I always like to break at least one time in my presentation the rule that you're not supposed to have a bunch of words on the slide. So I'm going to note that down in my captain's log for today, that I've achieved that. But as you kind of read through this, what you can see is that if you send this out to developers, which as you all know, developers are very excited to tell you bad things, things that they don't like. It's almost a hobby and part of the job description. And so as you look through this, it may seem like a lot of questions, but I would wager that if you put this kind of like raw excitement in front of a developer, I'm sure they would spend the 10 minutes or so to basically rate each of these on a scale of 1 to 5, right? And so you can imagine as a product manager, you get the response to this stuff back, and product managers usually know how to use Excel really well, so they know how to do ascending sort on a row, and maybe even group by sort of stuff, so they can cluster things together. But you can see that pretty much right away, the product manager will know what they need to start doing, right? And the good thing about this audit, again, it's kind of motivated by like developers love to tell you how things are screwed up. So what you can do is you can send this out every month, every 3 months, maybe even every week. And you can start to, again, you can see how you get this experiment loop in place. You can start to experiment and observe if what you're doing is helping your customers out, right? Because you can track the responses to these and see if things are getting better or worse or nothing. So putting in place this kind of way of listening to your developers and kind of surveying them initially is very important, because it tells you what to do initially, but then ongoing, it also will give you on the platform team a sense of what's working, what's not working. And then also there's a bit of a morale thing where, I don't know about you, but I like to see that things that I've done a good job. Sometimes I don't care. Like one of my favorite phrases is, I get paid either way. So sometimes it doesn't matter if I've done a good job, but more that I've done the job. But oftentimes, intrinsically, it's also more valuable and for a healthy life to actually see that you've done some quality work. And both on the developer side and the platform side, you can see that as you go through these questions, you're kind of constantly seeing that like, oh, things are getting better. Of course, I forget what the name of this is, but the floor of goodness always moves up and we forget that things are actually great, that we have, running water and indoor plumbing and things like that, which I appreciate. I don't know about y'all. So start off with a survey like that and maybe even continue with it. But the generalized thing there, again, that application developers would know is you need to have a feedback loop in place to kind of determine what your customers, what the developers are doing. Now, another thing that I see large organizations doing, which is counterintuitive is the wrong word, but it's not a natural thing of comfort for a lot of the people on a platform team, is they do a tremendous amount of marketing. Now, of course, I work in marketing. You never want to tell people you're marketing to that you're marketing to them. It's not good. So it's not like you're like, hey, come see our marketing. So you can use a word like advocacy or even training, consulting, things like that. But it doesn't matter. If you're on the platform team, it's good to think about it structurally as marketing, because again, marketing is a very well-known practice, especially in the technical world. And I think my colleague Deshaun likes to joke. Whenever someone tells them about a new platform team or initiative, like the first thing he asks is if they have a T-shirt yet, right? And because what's very important is brand, right? We'll go a little like marketing dilettantery here. Brand is very important because it latches on to someone's identity, right? Like, I'm sure, multiple people in here are like, I'm a Java developer, I'm a Rust developer, I'm a front-end developer. Like those are brands, those are parts of your identity, right? And what these large organizations do is they'll say like, I'm a I forget the names of all these things, but there's a platform in, I'm going to mess up the name. There's a platform in JP Morgan Chase called like Aurora or Aria or one of those like ancient Greek earth names. And like people will say like, I am that kind of developer, right? Like I deploy my stuff on that. There's another funny thing about branding that a US Airforce colonel once told me in an elevator. They'd been putting Agile in place, and he's like, the first thing you do is you never call it Agile. Once you call it Agile, what's going to happen is two things. One, people are going to tell you that you can't do it because missiles or something. And then two, everyone's going to go read the Agile books, and you're going to have endless meetings about how you're doing it wrong. So what you do is you come up with your own name for it, because obviously any practice that you have, you're going to custom fit to how it works in your organization. And it's similar for a platform team, right? You come up with a brand goes down into like these actual, like, you can't tell here, but this is an actual three-dimensional book, if you remember those, with paper and glue that Duke Energy back in the States used. Here's one from, as they call themselves now, BT. As you all know, unlike many people I talk with, they have an actual book of the principles. Like not only is it a manual and kind of like how to use things, but it's the idea of the marketing, the advocacy that they have. And then finally, you can see in Mercedes here, they also have this advocacy, this marketing, whatever you want to call it. And you can kind of see the activities that they follow, like things that they do to work with their customers, with the developer community, right? So it's a full-on thing. And oftentimes right away, you start with one person who's like the platform advocate, who, again, either online or whatever, they travel around, every 3 months or so, there'll be like a conference that's internally, right? Which I'll get to becomes a very valuable asset to have. But you think a lot about the marketing that you have. Now the next thing is, you remember you find all these components that you have, right? And even with infrastructure people, the thing about infrastructure people, just like developers, is they like to build things, right? That's kind of their deal. And so it's always very tempting for infrastructure people to build everything from scratch. Now, I know application developers, you remember all of your reuse components and don't reinvent the wheel. Hopefully no one in here has ever, except for academic purposes, like written a parser or something like that. So I'm sure none of you ever focus on rewriting something that you could just easily obtain, from some other source. But sometimes, again, those friends of yours that work at other organizations, they prefer to build things on their own and assemble them together. But what I see at large organizations is it's better to start with the assumption that we're just going to, at best, assemble together a bunch of parts, and all we're going to focus on is integrating things together. And until we discover that we actually need to fully customize and build things, we're going to start with something that's pre-built, essentially. And this will save you a lot of time, a lot of learning, and also it kind of sets up requiring having a thorough analysis of why you need to customize something. And I think it also gets to a point that's that's very important, which is like you need to get started very quickly getting feedback about the effectiveness of what you're doing, right? If you launch your platform initiative and you're like, I don't know, in a year, the developers can start using it. Like that's an anti-pattern that I've seen fail over and over again, where you build this out for a year and you don't really have any developers using it. And then you kind of ask them to come use it. And lo and behold, they're like, I don't want this, right? I mean, this is called the build it and they will come fallacy, if you remember that movie. Which gets us to this point. So the other thing that I see large organizations doing is they have that mindset I was going over, which is kind of two seemingly conflicting ideas. Is one, it's going to take a long time to really scale out this platform. To get hundreds, if not thousands of people using it is going to take many, many years, right? And this is important, especially when you're kind of putting together, let's call it the business case, the justification, the internal meetings and authorizations with management and other people who, like me, haven't programmed for 20 or so years, but for whatever reason are determining your fate in an organization. They're going to want like a very quick payoff for things. But you need to realize, and what I've observed, like this is an example of a DIY store back in the States, the Home Depot. And it took them like around 2015, I was actually in a meeting with some other people and a lot of their executives, and that's when they kind of kicked off this new way of development in a platform, and you can see it slowly creeps up until just recently, where it's affecting the rest of the business, right? Now, this is kind of an extreme case, and along the way, there's many applications that move to the platform and improvements that happen, but you need to have this like long-term view of how long it's going to take to spread to the entire organization, rather than having kind of like, by the end, like I've started to hear this distressingly a lot in the past year. I don't know, again, probably no one in this room, but I'll go talk, especially at government agencies, I'll talk with people who say like, oh, we have a mandate to move 60% of our applications to the cloud. And I'll say, oh, that's great. And they'll say like, by next year. And then it's like, oh, well, good luck with that. That sounds thrilling for you. Go from 0 to 60% in a year. Awesome, right? But you need to have this longer term view of what's going to take. So finally, let's get to like, that all sounds great. And I emphasize a lot of this starting up and the way you plan things out, because that's where a lot of the issues happen, right? Like people are fond of saying like, tool technology is easy, it's people that are hard. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but like you should never tell people what you do is easy, right? Tools are always very difficult. Programming is always hard. It's not actually. So tools, just remember that. If you ever feel the need to say that like technology and tools are easy, just don't say it. Always emphasize that it's difficult if you are being paid to make the technology work. Also, people are difficult, which is probably a bunch of managers saying that because that's what they program. So you want to stage that out and kind of know. And this is kind of like an amalgamation of what I see teams, platform teams doing. So first, they pick maybe one or two applications with developers. They put together kind of like the ideal team. And as they're building out the platform, this developer team is actually deploying to it, developing their application. And what you're really using that for is you're using it to discover what works, not only to learn how these things function and kind of like mesh things together, but you're discovering what works in your organization. Because while all the platforms more or less end up looking the same, how it fits into your organization and the practices of your organization, to use the word, the culture of your organization, is often very unique to your situation. And you need a way of discovering that and building that into the whole platform in the process, right? So if you imagine the opposite of this, we're going to move 60% of our applications to this platform, which means, let's say, 300 applications, and we're going to start all of them today. Like, everyone is going to make their own interesting, weird mistakes, and you're not going to be able to kind of like incorporate that into kind of the next app that you have and the next app that you have. So, and again, this is also why it takes a long time to do this. So you've got to plan out, starting small, and again, it's this feedback loop over and over again, observing what works and doesn't work and tuning it. Now, the other thing that is valuable here is you have these initial teams, let's say 1 to 3 teams, right? And what you do on these teams is you find people, both the platform people and the developers, who are like, interested in helping other people, let alone talking with them, which again, everyone in this room, I'm sure, loves that. But you can see that you would be the special elect, sort of empathetic, helpful people on the team. So you think about, on these initial teams, you've got a group of people who are learning a new way of doing things, a new skill set. And then as you add more and more teams, you follow this practice of, if you really want to do it, pairing and seeding. So you pair up on the team, you do pair programming and pair product management and everything, and you rotate these pairs so that you're educating each other and spreading the knowledge, all your bus number stuff. I mean, all that said, pair programming is like flossing, right? Like, we all know that we should be flossing, and it ends there, or at least for me. So don't come too close when I'm talking, I guess. But there's all these hygienic practices we're supposed to be doing, and we've seen the reports for decades that pair programming is good, but not for me. Like, that doesn't make sense. Anyways, if you're pairing on teams or somehow moving the knowledge on, what you end up doing at the end, maybe every 3 months or whatever, as you add new teams on, you take some of those people you've identified and move them to the new teams. And this in itself is an effective part of marketing, because this is another thing about marketing that I've learned over the years, is the worst person to convince a customer of something is the person who wants to sell them something. Right? It's much better to have a peer or someone else who's actually used this technology that's in your own organization, that you might even have lunch with, tell you that it's great and that it works, and also help you understand it, to build trust. There's even a term of art for this, WOM, word of mouth, which is like the ultimate prize in changing people's minds in marketing, if you will, is that you want to get other developers telling other developers that this platform is great, this new way of working is good, it actually works for them. And so that's what the seeding angle is when you start up a new team, you take at least one person from that initial team who's been successful. If they haven't been successful, maybe go to another team, but who's been successful on that team, and you move them to this new team so that they start spreading the WOM, the word of mouth, onto that team. And then again, through the nature of literal pairing or just kind of spreading knowledge, you can see, I have a philosophy degree, so I don't know how math works, but I think is that exponential? It's some sort of O or something, I don't know. I actually got a job in programming in high school, so when I went to university, as you would say, I was like, I guess I don't need a useful degree, so I got a fun one. Anyways, you can see that if you get, now you have 2 people on that team, then you have 4 people across other teams, and you get more and more people trained up that you can start pairing and seeding to other teams. But that very deliberate way of spreading use of the platform and the new way of developing, I see over and over again in large organizations. Well, hopefully some of that was useful for you. Like I said, it's always nice to give a talk to someone. If you want to, people use QR codes nowadays, which is exciting. I saw a great quote the other day that a QR code is your bank, which is both delightful and slightly scary. But you can get the slides and a bunch of other related platform stuff there if you're interested, so you can click on things. And with that, thanks for sticking around.